Greatest Story Ever Sold by Frank Rich. Read by Grover Gardner. Introduction. On that crisp blue Tuesday morning, I got the news, as most did, by phone. It was my sister-in-law calling from her office in Midtown Manhattan. She and her husband lived a block from the World Trade Center. "We're okay," she said. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "Turn on the television," she said. Thus began a day unlike any other that Americans of post-Pearl Harbor generations had seen. In my shock, the only analog I could summon was the assassination of President Kennedy, which happened on a similarly placid day, a Friday afternoon, when I was a junior high school student in Washington, D.C. Then, as on September 11, 2001, we knew we were experiencing some great, yet at some fundamental level, incomprehensible national trauma. Then, too, you could pick up the phone and not get a dial tone. Then, too, life in the foreground shifted into slow motion, if it was stirring at all, while the grave murmur of the network anchors continued without pause in the background. Then, too, we had to awaken to the reality that our country and our lives were in the hands of a Texas politician who, up to that moment, had not been counted among the more inspiring or impressive American leaders. But there were some differences. We'd never before seen colossal towers with thousands of people in them, perhaps people we knew, collapse into dust in real time before our eyes. When my wife and I briefly turned away from the TV screen to look out of our window, we saw the chilling sight of military aircraft in Mufti Olive hovering over the Hudson River. That was something else we hadn't seen before. We didn't have to be told we were at war. The enemy, though long hiding in plain sight, was one about which we knew scarcely more than we did about Lee Harvey Oswald. We knew just enough to be afraid. Although 9/11 was not yet known by that linguistic shorthand, it was a new morning in America. A wake-up call, you'd think, for a country that had become habituated to peace and prosperity, that had the luxury of devoting several years to obsessing about a president's seamy sex life. But whatever else 9/11 was, we can see now that it was the beginning of a new national narrative, a compelling and often persuasive story that was told by the President of the United States and his administration to mobilize a shell-shocked country desperate to be led. The story was often at variance with the facts that were known at the time, let alone with the facts that have come to light since, but it did have a slick patina of plausibility, the element that the satirical television talking head Stephen Colbert would later label truthiness. The story was effective enough to take America into a war against a nation that did not attack it on 9/11. This book is not intended to be a harangue about George W. Bush or the war in Iraq, though my views will certainly be evident. What it is instead is a critical retracing of the sophisticated steps by which some clever people in the White House, handed an opportunity and a mandate by the shocking events of 9/11, unfurled a brilliantly produced scenario to accomplish a variety of ends, the most unambiguous of which was to amass power and hold on to it. While the controversial policy choices made by the Bush administration are well known, equally important is the way it dramatized its fable to the nation and made it credible to so many, even when it wasn't remotely true. The chronicle of how a government told and sold its story is also inevitably a chronicle of an American culture that was an all-too-easy mark for the flim-flam. The synergistic intersection between that culture and the Bush administration's narrative is a significant piece of the puzzle. Only an overheated 24/7 infotainment culture that had trivialized the very idea of reality, and with it what was once known as news, could be so successfully manipulated by those in power. In an earlier America, it would have been far harder for a White House to get away with so many hollow spectacles and misleading public statements for as long as it did. When future Americans look back on this period and ask, how did this happen? The cultural context of the early 21st century may explain at least as much as the characters and official actions that played out again.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?